All right, good afternoon. I see our colleague Gianluca already on the screen. Gianluca will be with you in just a moment. If I ask you just to be patient for a few more minutes. So as mentioned, we'll be joined in a short while by Gianluca Rampolla del Tinardo, the resident coordinator and humanitarian coordinator for Venezuela. He's joining us from Caracas to brief you on what is going on following the earthquakes. And obviously, our teams on the ground are working hard, and we will have more from Gianluca in just a moment. This morning, the Secretary General delivered remarks at the 4th high-level conference on counterterrorism. He told participants that this year's meeting takes place at a moment of acute instability. This year also marks the 20th anniversary of the UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy and an opportunity to assess progress and to strengthen our resolve. Looking ahead, the Secretary General highlighted 4 priorities. He highlighted prevention, cooperation, technologies, and values. He told member states that our response must be rooted in the very principles that terror seeks to destroy. And that is that our efforts must be firmly grounded in the rule of law and in human rights. Terrorism is evolving, the Secretary General said, and so must we. Through prevention, through cooperation, and through unwavering commitments to human rights, we can build a safer world where people everywhere live free from fear. The full remarks were shared with you. Meanwhile, our Deputy Secretary General is in Hamburg, in Germany today, where she participated in the 3rd edition of the Hamburg Sustainability Conference. Delivering opening remarks, she called for urgent collective action to safeguard decades of development progress amid mounting geopolitical, economic, and climate-related challenges, warning that these overlapping crises risk reversing hard-won gains and pushing the Sustainable Development Goals further out of reach, underscoring the need for renewed multilateral cooperation and a more equitable international financial system and greater investment to accelerate progress towards the 2030 agenda. Ms. Mohammed also joined the panel discussions on UNAID reform, reinvigorating multilateralism, and strengthening collective responses to the Middle East crisis. On the margins, she met the president of Germany, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, as well as other senior government officials, including the German Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development, Ms. Reem Al-Baladi Rodovan, and the Minister for International Trade and Development Cooperation of the Netherlands. Over the weekend, Ms. Mohammed was in Cairo, in Egypt, where she convened a high-level dialogue on artificial intelligence and human development. The dialogue brought together global thought leaders from across the sector to discuss how artificial intelligence can support sustainable development while safeguarding human dignity and shared values. In Cairo, she also met with Egypt's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Badr Abdelati, expressing her appreciation for Egypt's constructive diplomatic engagements in efforts to address ongoing regional issues. Following her engagements in Hamburg, she will travel to London, where she's convening a high-level roundtable on sustainable development in an era of flux, and that will take place tomorrow, June 30th, and you'll hear more about it. Turning to Afghanistan and Pakistan, the Secretary General is deeply concerned by the latest violence between Afghanistan and Pakistan, which resulted in civilian casualties. He called for an immediate cessation of hostilities and the protection of civilians. The Secretary General reiterates his call on the parties to resolve their differences through diplomacy. We continue to call on all parties to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law and continue to stress that civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected at all times. In a statement issued this morning, the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, UNAMA, just confirmed that many civilians were killed and injured in these airstrikes carried out by Pakistan in the provinces of Paktika, and Kunar, which all these strikes took place last night. The UN mission is continuing its verification work on these incidents. We offer our condolences to the families of the victims and wish a speedy recovery for the injured. Our humanitarian colleagues tell us that the latest attacks have also reportedly triggered displacement, and humanitarian partners on the ground are assessing needs and preparing to provide emergency assistance. Turning to Lebanon, I was asked by a number of you about the latest developments on the political track between Israel and Lebanon. I can tell you that the trilateral framework between the U.S., the State of Israel, and the Republic of Lebanon, announced on June 26, constitutes a milestone in efforts to end decades of conflict and advance lasting stability. We continue to underscore the importance of resolving outstanding issues through dialogue to achieve sustainability on both sides of the Blue Line and to ensure sovereignty and security for both Israel and Lebanon. We are committed in supporting Lebanon and Israel to fulfill their obligations towards a long-term solution of the conflict in accordance with Security Council Resolution 1701. Meanwhile, our colleagues in UNIFIL tell us that no launch of projectiles were observed in the mission's area of operations over the weekend. However, peacekeepers continue to observe IDF forces' kinetic ground activities as well as air violations over Lebanon. UNIFIL observed airstrike near Deir Syrian in Sector East and Yonmor outside UNIFIL area of operations. A UNIFIL acoustic detection system also picked up 28 explosions in Deir Syrian yesterday. On Saturday, UNIFIL peacekeepers observed 2 Israeli tanks opening small arms fire towards Al-Mansouri in Sector West. Peacekeepers also encountered several restrictions on their movements, including yesterday when an IDF personnel blocked a UNIFIL explosive ordnance disposal team that was going to dispose of an explosive hazard on the road near Al-Bayada in Sector West. That caused a temporary halt of the mission. On the humanitarian front, UNIFIL, through its liaison branch, in coordination with OCHA, facilitated 3 humanitarian missions in Sector West on Friday. Our colleagues on the ground also report some positive trends in displacement and returns. They tell us that many people who were staying in collective shelters have started to return home, with sites closing as families leave. However, around 50,000 people remain in 469 shelters across Lebanon. Safety risk remains particularly due to reported contamination by unexploded ordnance across several locations across the southern part of Lebanon. Of course, all returns must be safe, they must be voluntary and dignified, and all people who return must have access and sustained support from humanitarian partners. Back here, the Security Council heard from Ramiz Al-Akarov, the Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process. He briefed via VTC from Jerusalem and said the situation across Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory has remained volatile, adding that Israeli airstrikes and military operations have continued across Gaza, resulting in further fatalities and bringing the total killed since the ceasefire to over 1,000. That's what the Gaza Ministry of Health is saying. On the humanitarian side, the Deputy Special Coordinator said the needs in Gaza remain immense. Sanitation conditions remain alarming. 70% of the population lacks dignified shelter. Humanitarians continue to face persistent constraints as they carry out their essential work. He condemned the continued killing and injury of Gazan civilians in Gaza, including women and children. Mr. Al-Akbarov is particularly concerned by recent increasing calls for the resumption of widespread hostilities in Gaza. This will be disastrous for the Palestinians in Gaza, for Israelis, and for the entire region, he warned. He reiterated the Secretary General's strong condemnation of the relentless expansion and acceleration of Israeli settlements in the West Bank. These developments further entrench the unlawful Israeli occupation and threaten the viability of a fully independent, contiguous, and sovereign Palestinian state. Meanwhile, on the ground in Gaza, OCHA tells us that daily strikes in populated areas and tightening of restrictions put civilians increasingly at risk. They cause displacement and limit access to basic services by people who need them. We and our partners are currently assessing the needs of dozens of families who've been displaced since the weekend in 2 areas along the so-called Yellow Line in the west of the Gaza Strip. East of the Gaza Strip, excuse me. You'll recall that this line was served to mark the part of the Gaza Strip, which is more than half of the land, that is virtually off limits to all Palestinians. Over 20 families have been displaced in eastern Deir al-Balah Governorate, and more than a dozen been displaced in the eastern part of Gaza City. Newly displaced people tell our humanitarian partners that they were ordered through quadcopter announcements or had fled when Israeli forces advanced towards their residential areas while dropping explosive munitions from the air. Deir el-Balah governor, new yellow cement blocks were set up, signaling further expansion of the area that are now off limits. We and our partners are supporting newly displaced families through rapid joint distribution mechanism. This morning, an airstrike in a location about 100 meters away from UN offices in Deir el-Balah. We've seen reports of casualties, though thankfully not among our own staff. Meanwhile, areas where restrictions apply on the movement of humanitarian staff are also expanding, covering about 65% of the land in Gaza. This latest shift to the orange line, which delineates those areas, was introduced just last Tuesday, effectively expanding by another 800 square meters the area where Israeli authorities urged the UN and our humanitarian partners to coordinate their movements. Having to coordinate every movement with Israeli authorities in most of Gaza undermines our provision. The impact ranges from higher operational costs to delays to complete cutting off of essential facilities such as Gaza's 2 sanitary landfills. Our humanitarian colleagues say that efforts are also undermined by the actions of forces affiliated by the de facto authorities who stop convoys for inspection or enter humanitarian warehouses, including in viable UN facilities. Just to note, this afternoon, the Security Council will reconvene at 3 p.m. for a meeting on maintenance of international peace and security at the request of Belarus, supported by the Russian Federation. Martha Poby, the Assistant Secretary General for Africa in the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations, will brief. Turning to Sudan, I can tell you that we welcome the announcement by the government of Sudan to extend the opening of the Adre border crossing with Chad until September 30th. This will continue to allow us to deliver humanitarian aid to those in need, despite ongoing security. Armed clashes continue near the Chadian border, and some humanitarian partners report that their operations have been suspended due to the worsening security conditions and communications disruption. Despite the volatile operational movement, humanitarian partners continue to deliver assistance, especially across Darfur. In West Darfur, for example, our partners last week completed cash distributions to about 250 families. In addition, general food assistance was delivered, reaching more than 42,000 people with monthly food rations. And in West Kordofan, where cholera continues to rise, our partners in health, water, sanitation say they are scaling up the response through the operation of cholera treatment facilities, deployment of rapid response teams, and strengthened surveillance capacity, as well as water chlorination efforts and the distribution of cholera supplies supported by the World Health Organization. However, continued constrained access, limited operational presence, and severe water shortages make the response that much more difficult. Meanwhile, the situation in El Obeid remains concerning. Drone attacks in the city have continued for a 3rd consecutive week. Local sources are telling us that a drone strike on June 27th reportedly hit areas near a school for girls, injuring at least 8 of these students. Once again, all parties to the conflict must ensure the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure and allow unimpeded humanitarian access wherever it is needed. Quick mention of a new report by UNDP warning that the recent military conflict in the Middle East has far-reaching economic consequences, particularly in developing countries. As oil prices surged, many governments had to spend more on fossil fuel subsidies to shield people from rising energy costs, leaving less money available for healthcare and climate action. Fossil fuel subsidies are now projected to reach $1.1 trillion this year, which is an increase of $410 billion compared to last year, reversing recent progress of reducing such spending. Today is the International Day of the Tropics, covering about 40% of the Earth's surface. The tropics are home to about 80% of the world's biodiversity. Tropical countries are also on the front lines of climate change, underscoring greater need for action to protect these vital systems. Chris, you may want to pay attention. We have a quiz for you today. This country is home to 7 UNESCO World Heritage Sites and is the largest country in Africa by area. Yes, who said Algeria? No, there you go. All right, I'll take questions. Oh, sorry, before I say we thank our friends in Algiers for their regular payment in full. We're now up to 117. Algeria paid $2,767,874 American dollars. And I can tell you, we deeply appreciate it, especially at this time of low cash flow. Sherwin, Bryce,
So I'll
please.
keep it on the continent,
Yeah.
all the way south. South Africa, Steph, is bracing for nationwide anti-immigration protests tomorrow, Tuesday, with concerns that they could turn violent. What message does the Secretary General have for South Africans, particularly in the context that many argue that undocumented migration is placing pressure on jobs and public services? How should governments respond to those concerns without undermining the rights and dignity of migrants?
Well, I can tell you that, first of all, the Secretary General and our country team, led by our colleague Nelson Mufu, have been closely following these developments, especially in advance of the mobilization announced for tomorrow. It's important that the situation remain calm, restrained, and there's full respect for human rights. I think, on your second question, like anywhere else in the world, addressing the impacts on a society of migration must be done within the rule of law, without discrimination, and in a manner that upholds the human rights and dignity of all people. We're seeing many countries throughout the world face this problem, but it's a whole of a society approach, right? It needs to be dealt with by ensuring inclusion of the citizens of the country, addressing the needs of migrants, of refugees, respecting their rights, also looking at the broader socioeconomic needs. Our team in South Africa will continue to work with the government, be as helpful as they can to try to address this. Yes, Ahmed.
Thank you, Steph. You didn't mention it in your readout, so I'll presume nothing's confirmed yet, but we have received notice that there will be a meeting in Doha between the United States and Iran on Tuesday. Will Personal Envoy Jean Arnault be in attendance?
No, I'm not aware that Mr. Arnault will be there. We've seen different reports about this meeting. All right. Yes, please, Mona.
Thank you, Stéphane. Just two questions. First, a quick follow-up on last week's open debate on children and armed conflict. Has the SG initiated any engagement or discussions with the parties named in the report since its release?
I mean, that's what the Office for Children in Armed Conflict is there for. They are in constant contact with those parties who are willing to engage, right, to try to improve the situation. I mean, the report's not about blacklisting. The report is about helping the protection of children. So we've seen parties that have, throughout the years, parties that have been listed, then working with the Office of the Special Representative, are delisted because of positions they've taken, and Ms. Fraser's door remains open, and they are actively working with those entities who are willing to be worked with.
Okay, just another question on the Ibrahimi Mosque. Today is the 9th day that Israeli authorities have prevented the call to prayer over there. Has the SG raised this specific issue with the Israeli authorities? And if so, what response, if any, has the UN received? Thank you.
People should have the right to worship in any holy site, in holy sites. It's a basic right. Abu Sufyan, then we need to go to our guest who's been very patient.
Thank you, Steph. I have a very specific question on counterterrorism. Terrorism is a big problem in South Asia, especially India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. But sometimes we notice that counterterrorism being used for political purpose. How do you see the counterterrorism as political tool?
I think I would encourage you, Abu Sufyan, to read what the Secretary General said, which is that the fight against terrorism must be done within the context of the rule of law. All right. I would ask our colleagues to put Gianluca back up on the screen.